Welcome everybody to our HR club, which we're holding online for the first time, which is a new experience for all of us. And although obviously we can't hold it in exactly the same format as we would do with one of our in-person HR clubs, we are doing our best to keep it to a similar kind of format. What are we going to look at today? So we're going to talk about how to consult with staff and how to do that fairly. That is a slight change of plan in terms of the topic that we thought we were going to cover, because since our last HR club in the middle of March, things have obviously completely changed in terms of the context that we're working in, and we thought we would rejig the topics and cover consulting with staff because that's obviously fairly topical. The environment is such that many employers are going to be needing to consult with their staff over a variety of issues, and so we hope that this will be a helpful session. What we're going to look at is why might you need to consult with staff? How do you do that effectively and fairly? What does a fair process look like? We're going to touch on the differences between individual consultation and collective consultation, and then we're going to look at some of the particular challenges around consulting with staff when many of them are working remotely. So Emma, if you could move me on to the next slide, please. So the context of consultation, why might we need to consult with staff? You might need to talk to staff about changing terms and conditions. And in this particular environment, given COVID-19, many employers are talking to staff about perhaps changing hours, possibly reducing pay, taking steps that they might need to in order to protect the business going forward, given the current challenges. You will also need to consult with staff if you're going through a redundancy process or a restructuring process, and Sarah's going to talk you through both of those as we go through the session. And equally, you might need to consult with staff if you were introducing new processes such as new terms and conditions, a new handbook or manual, for example. So given that many employers are likely to be needing to talk to their staff over the next few weeks, we hope that what we'll be able to do is give you some top tips for getting this process right as you deal with your staff. Emma, if you could take me on to the next slide, please. So the legal context, there's no law specifically setting out exactly what we need to do when we're consulting with staff, other than there are some specific rules around collective consultation. So when you're talking to groups of staff of 20 or more, and Sarah's going to talk about those shortly. So the main aim is to carry out a fair process, and that's what we're going to be focusing on. It's vital that we have in mind the rights of staff not to be unfairly dismissed, and as you'll be aware, that's something which applies generally when staff have got more than 2 years service. We also need to have in mind their rights in terms of things like discrimination and whistleblowing. So when we are thinking about running a process which might lead to a dismissal, such as redundancy, you need to think about not only having a fair reason for that dismissal, but also having a fair process that sits alongside it. And how you run your consultation process is absolutely key to ensuring that that process is fair. Even when you're running a process which you don't think on the face of it might lead to a dismissal, making sure that that consultation process is fair could avoid a challenge from that employee, which ultimately might lead to them raising a grievance or, worst case scenario, resigning and claiming constructive dismissal. So I'm going to hand over to Sarah now, who's going to take us through the next set of slides.
Morning, everybody. So yeah, I'm going to look at what consultation means, how you're going to put your proposals into action and plan out that process. So I'm going to kind of sketch that out a little bit more for you. And then, as Caitlin mentioned, I'm going to spend a little bit more time looking at redundancies and thinking about what you would want to cover during that process in terms of topics, and just then sketch out what a basic process might look like. So starting off with, what is consultation? And what that word really means in the context of consulting with staff over the sorts of changes that Caitlin talked about. So this is sort of thinking about how far you're required to go, really, to show that you've fulfilled your consultation obligations and consulted properly with your staff. So consultation isn't a sort of one-way flow of information. So you shouldn't think about it really as just you passing over the information on what you're planning to do and how you're planning to do it to your staff and thinking, right, we've done that, job done. It's more a sort of conversation really. It's thinking about a kind of exchange between you and the individual staff members or the employee group. But what it isn't is a negotiation that requires agreement with staff. So you don't need to reach a sort of agreement with them around what's going to happen or reach a compromise with them in order to have consulted properly. That there may come a point in a process where you say, you know, thank you very much, we've heard you, we've taken it all on board, but we're still going to do X, Y, or Z. So I suppose in terms of looking at it as a whole, that the sort of really crucial part of it is really thinking about going into it with an open mind and a sort of willingness to be persuaded that the things you thought were going to happen, you might slightly change what you'd planned. And I think if you go into a consultation process with that mindset, then hopefully it should make the process feel like it should. Emma, can we move on to slide number 6, please? So just to summarise that, it's very much a two-way process. The consultation needs to be genuine, you need to be getting feedback from staff, and you need to be alive to the possibility that the proposals that you've got might change as a consequence of what you consult with staff about, and you need to be open-minded about that possibility. Can we move on to the next slide, please, Emma? So Caitlin sort of highlighted the importance of process, and it is really critical in terms of how it will be viewed. And so this slide is really about looking at some broad principles that you'll need to follow to make that process a fair one. So starting off with adequate information. So you need to be giving staff enough information so that they can respond to the proposals. Usually that will be a business proposal or you setting out the rationale for the change that you want to make. So why is this happening? Is it budget related? Is it an internal review that's identified a better way that the business can be structured? And we always advise employers to work on formulating a sort of really clear rationale for what they're doing and capture that in a document. Because once you've got that set down, it can then be kind of adapted in any kind of communications you need to send out. So that might be presentations to all staff, it might be letters that you send. And I was speaking to a witness yesterday in the context of an investigation, and one of her complaints that there was a proposal to realign her role, but she wasn't really given any clear information as to why that was happening. And I think that's probably because the business felt a little bit uncomfortable about what they were doing. But that lack of information has led to her feeling really upset and feeling like there's another agenda to sort of get her out of the business. So making sure you've got that information set out in a clear way is really important. Giving enough time in order for employees to respond. I think it's always a bit of a balance really between allowing enough time for people to be able to consider everything, but not unnecessarily dragging out what is often quite a stressful process. So in an individual say it's a redundancy consultation, you'd want to be usually giving a sort of minimum of 2 days notice, I would say, for things like consultation meetings. Often it will be a bit longer than that. The third point is a sort of conscientious consideration of the response. So this really is a lot about evidencing your thought process really in the way that you communicate to staff in respect of some of the suggestions they might make. So in practice, that's a little bit more, I think, than we thought about your suggestion, but we decided it wasn't going to work. It's more giving a sort of brief summary really. So yeah, we considered this, but we didn't think it would work because it wouldn't achieve the cost savings required. It wouldn't address our organisational challenge, that sort of thing. The next one's really around a sort of collective consultation process, and I'll go on to talk about that in a bit more detail, but that's around allowing, if you've got representatives who you're consulting with rather than individuals, that's about making sure that you build enough time into your processes to enable those reps to have feedback with their constituents really, and allow that whole process to happen. And as I said, there's no obligation to adopt proposals. It's a consultation. It's enough to say that you've consulted, but you've decided to reject proposals that are made. Emma, could we go on to the next slide, please? So thinking about sort of top tips really in terms of making consultation really effective. And this is the sort of things that we've found over the years when we've been supporting employers with this. Planning process is really important. Don't launch into a process without having planned out what you intend to happen and when. And that plan can then be shared with the people who are helping you to manage that, be that the managers that are involved, your HR support if you've got it, and in broader terms with the staff that are going to be involved. So a timetable is really critical. That's going to be a key part of your planning. Spelling out those key dates. What do you intend to happen when? This date will announce to staff. This date will have individual meetings, right through to the date when you'd plan to issue notice. The sort of next part is notice periods. Often you might have different groups of people with different notice periods, particularly if you operate statutory notice. So you need to think about, when that notice would, if you've got a target date in mind for when you want the process to complete, you need to sort of work backwards and fit in notice and think about, whether you'd want to pay in lieu of notice and that kind of thing. Also, if you've got staff on furlough, and you want to try to tie your notice periods in with the furlough scheme and payments under the furlough scheme, then you need to factor that in as well. Communications, really important. So a good idea, I think, to draft all of your template letters, your scripts, everything, all the documents that you'd want to be using in the process. Yes, they might need changing, but at least it gives you a starting point. And none of that planning makes the process sort of predetermined. It's fine to do all of that. I think if you'd written all the letters, signed them, dated them, put them in an envelope ready to send, that's going to be going a bit too far. But actually planning it all out in that way is absolutely fine. Caitlin, can you, sorry, Emma, could you move on to the next slide, please? So I'm going to focus a little bit more on consultation processes in respect of redundancy. So as Caitlin said, there's lots of different processes where you might need, lots of different situations that might involve a level of consultation. I've sort of touched on this concept of there being a distinction between an individual consultation and a collective redundancy situation. The basic position is all redundancy situations involve a level of consultation. When I talk about individual consultation, I'm not meaning only one person is going to be affected. I'm meaning you are consulting with that individual person about what's happening, rather than the situation you have in a collective consultation, where instead of consulting with the individuals, you're consulting with somebody appointed to represent those individuals. As Caitlin mentioned, there's no prescriptive redundancy process set down in law, but I'll talk about what a basic process generally looks like in a moment. Collective consultation really just adds an additional layer of obligation on an employer in terms of things they need to do. What it doesn't do is replace the individual consultation process, so you need to be able to evidence both. Emma, can we move on to the next slide, please? So, collective consultation. A collective consultation comes into play where there are 20 or more people which the employer is proposing to make redundant. It can apply where there is a process of changing terms and conditions of employment if that process is looking at doing that via termination and re-engagement. Now, I suppose this redundancy and collective consultation are really a sort of topic in themselves, and we could devote a whole HR club to that and looking at some of the issues that come up. But all I would say is if you are in that kind of situation where you're thinking about those larger scale redundancies or a larger scale change to terms and conditions, then you just need to think about whether that duty is going to be triggered and how you might manage that. And I think in that scenario, you definitely want to be taking legal advice at an early stage, because it will feed into your planning. But broadly, what the law says is where there is a collective consultation, that consultation must begin in good time, and in any event, at least 30 days in advance of 20 to 99 redundancies within a 90-day period, and at least 45 days in advance of 100 plus redundancies within a 90-day period. And those redundancies occur on the date that the first of the proposed dismissals will take effect. So that's the day the individual's employment ends. What it really does is it acts as a sort of stop the clock, really. So you cannot then implement certainly the termination of employment during that period. It means that you have to wait and go through an effective consultation period. So I think probably that's all I'll say about collective consultation and what that means. Can we move on to the next slide? So thinking about consultation in a redundancy situation, the first thing you're going to be thinking about is, well, what exactly is a redundancy situation? Are we in one? And what's going on in terms of what's happening within the business that's prompted us to be thinking about redundancy? Because there are a number of sort of different types, if you like. So, and the law provides us with a bit of detail about that. So, for example, it might be that you've got a place of work that's moving a long way, or perhaps it's disappearing entirely. So when Dyson moved all of its operations over to Asia, that was that sort of situation. Perhaps the business is ceasing altogether, and we've seen some of that during the COVID pandemic. For example, right at the outset, we had Flybe that closed. It might be that you've got fewer people required to do the same job. So you might have a sort of new process, a new system in place that actually means that you don't need as many people to do the work as you did before. Or it might be that actually you've lost a big contract or a big piece of work, and you need to make cost savings as a consequence. And an important message to give to staff as part of that process is, you know, this is not personal. This is not about your performance. It's not saying you haven't done your job properly. It can often feel very personal to staff, I think. So I think it's often helpful to sort of stress that as you go through. So in a moment, I'm going to sketch out a process. Can we move on to the next slide, Emma? So what do you need to make sure you cover? I mean, we've talked about how you can make it fair, and we've talked about how you might practically do that in terms of the way you approach it. But what about the sort of subject matter of the consultation? What do you need to make sure that you cover? The things below are identified as things you need to cover as part of a collective process. So these are sketched out for us in law, but in an individual consultation, you're going to be thinking about the same sorts of things. So for example, avoiding the dismissals. That's generally what you talk about at the beginning of a process, and that's looking at things like the business rationale, the underlying business situation, and thinking about consultation around that. The next part is reducing the number of employees to be dismissed. So is there a way that fewer employees can be affected by this? So you would want to be looking at whether there are any strategies around that and talking to staff about that. And sort of the next one is mitigating the consequences of the dismissal. So sort of that's when you've had the conversations about, does this need to happen? Who's going to be affected? And you've sort of moved on beyond that to think about, okay, so what are we talking about in terms of redundancy payments? Can we offer any outplacement assistance? How can we sort of mitigate the impact of this situation? I mean, really, you want to be thinking about, what is it that staff are going to be feeling really anxious about? And for them, most of the time, it's going to be, why is this happening? What process are you going to follow in this? What are the timescales? When's it likely to take effect? So when am I likely to be out of a job? And crucially, you know, how much money, what's my financial entitlement going to be? Generally, those are the things that employees are really concerned about. So can we move on to the next slide, please, Emma? So this is looking at a basic collective redundancy process and what that might look like. So what you'll probably have is you'll go through a process of electing reps or appointing reps if you've already got a sort of standing body of staff who are appropriate to be able to be consulted on this kind of thing. So you will have a sort of first meeting where, as an employer, you will communicate the proposals, you'll talk about it, what it is you're trying to do, and you'll agree a timetable. In that second meeting, you'd generally be allowing your employee representatives to respond to those proposals, thinking about issues around, you know, that subject matter we talked about. So can we avoid the redundancies? Can we reduce the amount of redundancies? Are there any alternatives we can look at? I think if you've got an option of looking at alternative roles or opportunities, you'd also want to be thinking about that. And in the third meeting, you might then be looking at, you know, how is this all going to happen? What's the consultation timeline going to be like, and those sorts of things. Emma, could we just go on to the next one? Thinking about a sort of basic individual redundancy process, usually how this will play out is kind of in a similar way. You will have a sort of first meeting with staff or with the individual, which will be very much employer-led. So this meeting, you'll be sort of presenting how you've got to where you've got to, looking at the business rationale. If you're pooling and choosing between employees, looking at selection criteria. The second step in the process will be scoring, if you are going to be scoring staff, because they're being selected between a sort of bigger number, and inviting them to that second meeting. The second meeting is generally more employee-led, so it will be their opportunity to respond to everything that you've said, perhaps respond to their scoring, making any suggestions, that kind of thing. And often, as an employer, you won't say an awful lot about meeting. There might be things that you can reply to, but often you'll want to go away and think about things, and then sort of confirm any questions or issues back to the employee in between times. And then I think we've sort of slightly had something fall off the end of the slide. but often your third meeting will be a meeting around, sort of often your final meeting, in terms of, okay, we've thought about everything you said, we've dealt with all of the issues, and this is sort of the final meeting that we'll have with you, and you will have warned the employee at that point that after this meeting, it's if nothing else comes up, it is likely that they'll receive notification that their employment's going to be terminated. And so you need to make sure that letter inviting them to that meeting is covers all the necessary bits of information. I'm getting into detail of communications and things at this point, so I think we'll probably leave it there. So I think, Emma, I think what we're going to do now is move back across to Caitlin, who's going to talk a little bit about some of the other issues around COVID and remote consultation.
Thanks. Emma, could you go on to the next slide, please? Brilliant. So I'm just going to tie up this section of the session by thinking about some of the particular challenges that we're facing at the moment, given the context of COVID-19. So we have got many staff who are working remotely from home. Some of you will have workplaces which have been perhaps open throughout or are starting to open up, and you're working in a socially distanced way. But there are some particular challenges in terms of how you run a consultation process when you've got many or all of your staff working remotely. It is possible, but we need to think through quite carefully about how we manage the process. So consultation meetings can take place via video platforms such as Zoom, and many of us will have been conducting much of our work in this way in recent weeks. You'll need, of course, to make sure that the staff you want to consult with have got the necessary IT in order to be able to engage with that. So we can't just assume that everybody has got the smartphone or the laptop that means that they can log in and take part in meetings such as this. You'll need to think about whether any reasonable adjustments are needed for staff who might have disabilities in order to enable them to take part and engage with the process fully. So you'll need to give that some thought. You're going to need to plan the process out carefully, and as Sarah said, that's important with any consultation process, but you might want to allow a bit more flexibility within your timetable to allow for any particular technical difficulties or issues people might have with doing consultation in a remote way. Large staff meetings, I think, might be impractical to do via a video platform. So I think we've got to recognise that there are some limitations. If, for example, you wanted to hold a large staff meeting to talk to them about the fact that there's a redundancy process starting, I think you'd want to consider whether that's an appropriate forum, or whether it might be better to do that bit in writing and then perhaps follow up with people in smaller groups or individually. For individual consultation meetings, this sort of video format works quite well, and provided everybody can access it, should be something that you can do. Think about who needs to be present at that meeting. So it might be that for smaller meetings, you can be the manager or HR directly with that individual and nobody else is present, and that would be fine. But it's possible that that individual will want their union rep to be present, and they would have a right to have that union rep present if it was a meeting potentially leading to their dismissal. So how are you going to accommodate that? Well, you can obviously have meetings via a video platform with more than one person, so you need to think about that in advance. Again, that might, there's a bit more planning involved, but think about how that's going to work, and see if you can make that happen. What about if you have staff who are furloughed? Can you go ahead with a consultation process? Well, the furlough guidance from the government envisages that redundancy consultations will be able to go ahead during a period of furlough, so you definitely can go ahead. and it's going to be reasonable to consult, and in fact, if anything, your thinking around fairness is probably heightened given the particular challenges. So absolutely you can carry on with staff who are furloughed. Although staff are not allowed to carry out work while they're furloughed, the guidance does say that employees who are union or non-union representatives can undertake duties and activities for the purposes of representing other employees, meaning that they can come along and accompany colleagues to meetings if they need to as part of the consultation process. And then finally, what if you have staff resisting and saying that they don't want to engage with an online consultation and they don't think it's going to work? What do you say to them? And I think the first step, as with many situations where you have some pushback from employees, is to try to understand what their concerns are and see whether you can reassure them around that in order to get them to agree to it. If you can't, and what they're saying is, I really want a face-to-face meeting, then you're going to need to think about whether that's something that you can accommodate safely and in line with the current government guidance on social distancing. You may be able to do that. Alternatively, you might need to look at, can you do this over the phone? As a last resort, can you do it in writing? We would always say that would be absolutely a last resort, but it may be something that you would need to think about doing. So that's the end of our session in terms of Sarah and I talking you through the slides. But thank you very much for joining us. Please feel free to follow Narrow Quay HR or the VWV Employment Team Twitter accounts, where there are lots of podcasts and webinars that we're sharing at the moment. Our next HR club is due to be in September. Who knows whether that will be in person or one of these sessions, but we'll send out details shortly. And if you do need any support with consultation exercises, then of course, please feel free to contact either Jessica, Jo, Sarah or me. Thanks very much.
Thank you.